Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we're talking about further delays in Libya's presidential election. We're talking about a massive US arms sale to Egypt and student protests in Italy. First up, presidential candidates in the Libyan elections held a forum in the capital Tripoli, renewing their calls for elections. Libya failed to hold presidential elections on December 24th last year, raising anxiety about the future of the country's tenuous peace process. The December vote would have coincided with the country's 1951 independence date and was aimed at electing a new interim government acceptable to a majority of the Libyan people. The internationally led peace process succeeded in late 2020 in ending much of the fighting in Libya's 7-year civil war, but has been unable to bring warring factions to any broader consensus. Abdul of People's Dispatch joins us now. He covers the region. Abdul, UN mediators are suggesting June as a possible window for these elections to finally go ahead. We understand why elections are crucial, of course, but explain to us the political and economic scenario in which Libyans are currently living.
First of all, the proposed date of June looks very optimistic at this moment, particularly because there is no consensus among the different factions in Libya at this moment. Even the parliamentary committee, which is assigned the job of holding the elections, just proposed earlier this week, that they will not be able to hold the election until in June. Basic reason is, apart from the confusions about the legality of the electoral law, the problems about it, there are also the political condition in the country at this moment, which is not very favorable to holding elections at the time, because the division between the East and West, by and large, remains the same. The southern part of Libya, there is a considerable, particularly rise of violence in the last few months. There is news that ISIS has regained some grounds, and there are fightings in that region also. Libyan oil production, which was resumed last year, with Libya being one of the largest producers of oil in this region, has not picked up much space because of the difficult economic and political conditions in the country. So given the larger political divisions, given the economic conditions in the country, and there is lack of consensus among different factions in the country, it will be very difficult at this moment to hold the elections, despite the fact that UN is pushing for it. Even basically General Secretary is a special representative advisor in Libya, basically said that the only way to resolve the Libyan conflict is to basically hold the elections as soon as possible.
Right.
Which is, I will say, given the complexities, it is not possible at this moment.
Right. Okay. Can you also paint a picture for us of who actually is running the country, and sort of how are people dealing with all the uncertainty and the lack of any sort of proper path towards governance?
There is a system which was established last year after the UN-led peace process, which is called Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, which established an interim administration led by Abdul Hamid Dabeba. Now he's the prime minister, but he is also a candidate in the presidential election, and therefore, which has led to the Libyan parliament, which is a parliament which was elected in 2014, has its own problems of legitimacy and on. Still, that parliament basically there is a debate going on whether Dabeba should continue or not. So the interim administration led by Dabeba is under question. Its legitimacy is under question. There is a presidential council which was also established last year. 3 different leaders are leading it, which basically runs the government at this moment. The Libyan parliament is also debating. There is a vote which will happen any time now, which proposing to elect a new person instead of Dabeba. So basically, who is running the government at this moment is there is a titular head of the presidential council, which is running the government, which has created some kind of stability in last a year or so after the 10 years of war in the country. But even its legitimacy is under question because the different war groups which control different parts of Libya, though they have agreed to accept the legitimacy of the interim administration in Tripoli, had retained their pockets of influence. So they also play a role in running the local administration in different parts of the country.
All right. Thank you very much for that update, Abdul. Right, next up, the US state government approved on Tuesday 2 major military equipment sales to Egypt of transport aircraft and radar systems. The announcement comes amid widespread concerns over the Abdel Fattah al-Sisi government's treatment of political opponents and a spiraling human rights crisis. Estimates indicate that the regime is holding as many as 60,000 political prisoners in its jails. There have been frequent public protests against police brutality, torture and custodial deaths, and rights groups have urged the international community to intervene on behalf of the Egyptian people. The Biden administration, meanwhile, has budgeted $1.4 billion in aid to Egypt in this current fiscal year, much of which is also military assistance. Our magical chair has been replaced by a magical television screen, and Prashant is on it now. Prashant, US Congress's own Egypt Human Rights Caucus has come out and said that the government is not doing enough about human rights concerns. So what is at play here in terms of US military sales and aid to Egypt?
Right, Siddhant. I mean, at this point, you often get the sense that a lot of the protestations about human rights that have been often made in the United States are just, just for the sake of it, just statements made to, so that their arms deals and the kind of support they offer to dictators and warmongers across the world is made palatable. And I think no other case exemplifies it so much as the case of Egypt, I think, where some years ago we had Donald Trump going on record to say that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was his favorite dictator. So, like or dislike Trump, he had this habit of exposing the US foreign policy establishment for what it is, even if unintentionally. And this is a very classic example. Because we do see, of course, that you mentioned the 60,000 political prisoners, the kind of torture, the kind of agony that these political prisoners endure is very difficult to describe. There have been a number of documented instances of human rights violations. Human rights organizations are finding it very, very difficult to function in Egypt. In fact, one of the oldest organizations in the region actually shut down recently because they said that they could not continue working in the current circumstances. Its director, Gamal Eid, for instance, has been strongly targeted, strongly prosecuted. We have cases like Ala Abdul Fateh, whose mother recently spoke to People's Dispatch and who talked about how the government's response, this government seems to be one which wants to basically keep tabs on all of its citizens, wants to prevent any kind of dissent at all. It wants to ensure that the only, that any kind of dissent in the country is repressed. We just crossed the 11th anniversary of the uprisings which overthrew Hosni Mubarak, which was the landmark moment. And what is called that revolution, the Arab Spring, was actually reversed by Sisi. And he has, put into place this massive repression apparatus, completely and qualitatively on a ground, completely and qualitatively different from anything that existed before. So it's pretty obvious that, the violations that we're seeing right now are even in terms of Egypt's own brutal history of human rights violations, this is completely another level. And nonetheless, the United States has continued to, continue its support. I think recently there was you mentioned the 1.3 to 1.4 billion annual aid. Of that, around 300 million is supposed to be conditional. Now, some time ago, the United States had made 130 million of that 300 million conditional while allowing the other 170 million. And yesterday, the US, I believe the US spokesperson was actually asked that what sense did it make if you are holding back $130 million in aid and at the same time offering $2.5 billion in terms of arms deals. And this is, I think, the State Department spokesperson, Ned Price, who basically said that if we have anything to add on that, we'll let you know. So that's really the kind of response that the US government has to this. And again, it's important to note that in justifying these $2.5 billion, it says that, and I'm reading this statement, it says that a proposed sale will, among other things, provide airlift support for its forces by moving supplies, equipment, and people, thus strengthening its capacity in the security and humanitarian arena. So to suggest that providing military aid to Egypt is helping in the humanitarian arena is the heights of irony and really twisting around words for what is basically just money for American corporations.
Yeah, absolutely. So just carrying on from that, Prashant, we are seeing public protests and people spontaneously taking to the streets to oppose all of this police brutality. How are they managing to mobilize, and is there some kind of strong opposition being built to this regime?
It's very difficult to say, Siddhant, because right now, like I said, the situation is pretty bad over there. Any kind of opposition is being crushed with an iron hand. We saw protests did take place in 2019 and 2020, but both of these protests, especially the 2019 ones, were very, very strongly repressed. A lot of activists, at various stages who were coming out of jail were again put back into jail, and many of them are being accused with charges like fake news. These omnibus charges, which basically mean that they posted on Facebook or Twitter, which is really the charge against them. So what we're seeing is actually, I think, a very heightened stage of repression, and very unlikely that there is any strong, opposition building up right now, especially considering the full-scale support Al-Sisi has from both the West as well as the neighbors such as Saudi Arabia and Israel and the United Arab Emirates.
Okay, thank you very much for that update, Prashant. We'll move on now to our final story of the day. We're talking about Italy, of course, where Italian students have been on the streets in anger after an 18-year-old student, Lorenzo Parelli, was crushed to death while working an internship for a private company in the province of Udine in northern Italy. The same night, on January 21st, students in Italy's capital organized an action in front of the Ministry of Education, University and Research. The following day, students organized protest actions in cities across Italy in front of the offices of the General Confederation of the Italian Industry. On the afternoon of Sunday, January the 23rd, which was the third consecutive day of protests, police attacked students in Rome and multiple injuries were reported. Prashant, the tragic death of this 18-year-old has catalyzed what it seems to be young Italians' anger in terms of what's going on in terms of the economy and COVID-19 and multiple other situations on the ground.
Absolutely, Siddhant, because Italy, like you said, this is one instance, and I think it's wrong on the other hand to see this as just an isolated instance, because we're talking about a country where I think at the end of 2021, the unemployment rate of those under 25 was almost 30%. And this is double many of the other countries in Europe. And we have seen over the years in Italy and many other European countries, but especially in Italy, the gutting of the education system, the gutting of all social services for that matter, which we have talked about time and again on the show. But education is one of those sectors which has especially been gutted. And along with, of course, any other kind of government expenditure, which means that students are really left
their own devices.
Exactly, on their own devices, both while in school and once they get out of school. So I think that continuity of being left isolated and being left abandoned is very much strong among Italian youth. And I think it's important to note, of course, that this is part of something that the boy who died, he was doing his internship as part of something which was introduced in 2015 as a mandatory internship process for young Italian students, and that is supposed to make them more job worthy, etc., etc. But like I said, this is not really the case, and students have been increasingly aware that there's a very strong sentiment among them that they feel that they're basically just being primed to be automatons on the job market, and that's really that's all they're being trained to be. In fact, there have been a number of instances of occupations by school students over the past year, in recent times. And of course, all this was made worse by the fact that during the pandemic, the inequality that came about due to lack of digital access across the world, of course, is a global phenomenon. But Italy was one of the countries where it was really very obvious, and people really struggling due to lack of digital access. And once they came back, they also saw that a lot of the infrastructure, barely anything has been changed. Transport is still very bad. So I believe in 2020, the numbers said that nearly 13% of young people did not finish school and they had left early. The latest numbers are not there. But all this, I think, together sort of painting a very dismal picture of the future that Italian youth have at this point. And I think this death and the fact that the brutal way in which Lorenzo Parelli died actually has I think really hit hard among a lot of Italian youth. In fact, I think not I think today, that is 28th, there's actually a massive protest that is going on right now. We'll be following that as well. But the other fact, of course, also that Italy is also a country where there's very unsafe working conditions. And this is something, again, progressive movements, trade unions have been highlighting for the longest time. A number of workplace accidents that are taking place, I believe. There's an estimate which says that 4 to 5 people die in such accidents every day. And that over time, in fact, regulation has been weakened, which allows, say, workplace security checks for that matter. All this has been weakened. So we are seeing, I think, a confluence of factors that is bringing Italian youth, Italian students on the ground. And this is not an issue the government can sort of, let go so easily, because the anger is really, really very palpable.
Right. So like Prashant said, we'll be covering those protests as they continue in Italy and bringing you updates as and when we have them. That's all we have on the show for today. From Prashant, myself, and the entire People's Dispatch team, thank you very much for watching. For more on these stories and all the work that People's Dispatch does, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org. And also do give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for regular updates. We'll be back again, same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.